welcome to this long-awaited and much-anticipated evening with Elif Shafak. My name is Sam Wells. I've been the vicar here at St. Martin's for the last 5 or more years. And for those of you who don't know St. Martin's is a unique configuration of commercial and cultural and charitable ventures, all focused around a vibrant congregation. Across the road we have the busiest homeless day centre in the country. Downstairs mostly and a little bit outside we have a vibrant commercial enterprise which helps to support our various kinds of outreach. We also have the BBC Radio 4 Christmas appeal that brings in about £3 million a year. We have something like 400 concerts here in the course of a year, so a hugely dynamic classical music program. But the person who's come to speak to us and with us tonight represents in many ways the aspirations of St. Martin's to be an inclusive, dynamic conversation host and stimulator. Elif Shafak is a person who talks a lot about Istanbul and in some ways is Istanbul in the sense that she crosses the cultures of East and West. She opens the hearts of many to each other's traditions, and she talks about faith in a way that includes space for doubt, and for doubt in a way that it actually encourages and stimulates faith. I couldn't be more excited to have her among us tonight. She's going to be introduced now by Paul Gordon Chandler, for whom the only simple word is genius. Paul Gordon's genius is to bring together Judaism and Christianity and Islam, East and West, Arab and Jew, Westerner and almost every tradition under the sun. He does it in all kinds of ways. Right now, in this place, he's done it through the I Am exhibition that you'll all be having a glance at downstairs afterwards if you haven't already. He is a genius because he enables us to bring our very best to the conversation of cultural and religious encounter. I'm delighted that he's with us tonight. It's been his genius that's put tonight together, and he's going to introduce our distinguished speaker. Thanks for coming.
Good evening, and that was a nice introduction, wasn't it? I'm not often called a genius, and we all know better. On behalf of Caravan, I'd like to thank all of you for attending this evening's program, and as was just mentioned a minute ago, it's done in association with the I Am exhibition, which is actually downstairs in the crypt galleries, and it will be open just after the program, so you'll have a chance to see it if you haven't already seen it. As the world's attention is focused anew on respecting women's rights, and while there's an increasing need for developing understanding and certainly encouraging friendship between the people and faiths of the Middle East and West, the I Am exhibition is actually a peace-building exhibition that showcases the insights and experiences of Middle Eastern women as they confront issues of culture and religion and social reality in a rapidly changing world, both in the Middle East and in the West. It's designed to address misconceptions and challenge often held stereotypes, which all too often exist, as we know today. And it features 31 acclaimed Middle Eastern contemporary women artists from 12 different countries. And what it is, actually, it's a visual celebration, if you will, celebrating their strengths and rich and diverse contributions in the enduring global quest for peace and seeking a more harmonious future. The exhibition premiered this last May at the National Gallery of Fine Arts in Amman, Jordan, under the patronage of Her Majesty Queen Rania Al Abdallah. Came here and it opened here at St. Martin in the Fields in early July, and it will close on the 20th of August, so that's next Sunday. And then it will tour throughout the United States for about 18 months, premiering in Washington, D.C. at the American University Museum in early September. And behind all of it, and certainly behind this evening, is this belief that the arts can actually be one of the most effective mediums to enhance understanding, to bring about respect, to enable sharing, as I'm assuming will be done this evening, and certainly at the end of the day to deepen friendship between those of different faiths and cultures in the Middle East and West. In the profound words of this evening's special guest, in art there is no them. The other is me. And throughout the IM tour, there's a series of programs and activities that are planned around each exhibition venue to encourage dialogue, to enhance understanding, to stimulate discussion, and that's what brings us to this evening. And tonight, we're very privileged to have with us Elif Shafak. Elif Shafak is an award-winning novelist. Many of you know about her, but I'll give you just a brief introduction. She's the most widely read female writer in Turkey. She's a cultural commentator, a political scientist, a public intellectual. She's an activist on women's rights and minority rights, freedom of speech. She has a multidisciplinary academic background, a degree in international relations, a master's degree in gender and women's studies, and a PhD in political science. She writes extensively about a wide range of issues, including global and cultural politics, the future of Europe. I wish she would write about the future of the United States, Turkey and the Middle East, secularism, and faith. She regularly contributes to global publications such as the Financial Times, the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Guardian, and the list goes on. A TED Global speaker, she's a founding member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And she writes in both Turkish and English and has published 15 books, 10 of which are novels, including the bestsellers The Bastard of Istanbul and The 40 Rules of Love. Her books have been translated into 47 languages, and she's been awarded the prestigious Chevalier des Arts et Lettres. Her latest novel, The Daughters of Eve, was published just this last February, 2017, and is actually available this evening downstairs when we have the book signing, for the first time, actually, in paperback. Of course, a lot more could be said about Elif, but we're all here to hear her, not to hear just about her. The structure of the evening, just to give you some awareness of how it will take shape, she will speak briefly on East, West, and Global Souls is the title, be followed by a conversation with Reverend Sam Wells, and then there'll be a short time of question and answers from the audience. Would you please welcome with me the reason we're here, Elif Shafak.
Thank you so much. I feel very honored to be in such a unique space with you, and I'm also very much looking forward to your thoughts, your questions, your critical remarks. I would love to turn this into a dialogue. I don't like monologues, so let's please contribute together, all of us. That's why I want to keep my talk very, very short and tell you a little bit about my background, my own journeys. I think life is always about journeys. I think we're made of water. Our main element is water. It's fluid. It has to flow. It's not static. And water has always been an important symbol for me, for my writing. I do not like identity politics. I'm very critical of identity politics. Especially identity politics when it's defined as an exclusivist, static, stable category that tries to pin us down, narrow us down. I think that is very much against our nature, against the element of water. So instead of identity politics, I like multiple belongings, plural. I think we all have multiple belongings, and I think it's fabulous that we feel emotional attachments to the lands where we come from. But at the same time, I believe it's possible to carry lots of belongings. Sometimes in Turkey, these are very difficult subjects to talk about, and I have been criticized, and some people have said, well, she doesn't have roots. But I always thought I do have roots, but maybe my roots are not necessarily rooted in the soil. maybe I'm inspired by this tuba tree that is used as a metaphor a lot in Ottoman literature, and it is supposed to be a tree that has roots up in the air so that it can, get the sun, connect with the air, but also connect with multiple spaces. So this notion of multiplicity is very important for me. And I like to think of myself, of course, as an Istanbulite. I am an Istanbulite. I'm very attached to Istanbul. Istanbul plays a very important role in my writing, and not as a passive background scenery, but as a character of her own, and as always as a she character, because I think Istanbul is a she city with a very strong feminine energy. So I do see myself as an Istanbulite, but at the same time, I'd like to think of myself as someone who's attached to the Balkans, to the Aegean, to the Mediterranean. There are lots of elements in my soul that I carry with me everywhere, and some of those elements do come from the Middle East. And I am a European by choice, the values that I share, the values that I uphold. And I've been in this beautiful city for the last 7.5, almost 8 years now, and I do consider myself a Londoner now. So for me, these multiple identities do not necessarily contradict, or multiple belongings. They do not necessarily clash, but I'm interested in their coexistence. And I would like to think of myself, hopefully, as a global soul, and hopefully as a world citizen. And I do sincerely believe that if we can all have multiple belongings, there's a bigger chance that my belongings, multiple belongings, will overlap with yours, like in concentric circles. Whereas the other way around, when we are narrowed down to a single category, which is static and exclusivist, if we do that, then clashes are inevitable. So I am worried because I think we have entered a time in human history when we are veering towards tribalism, what I see as tribalism. We are being told by multiple people, multiple demagogues, ideologues, that if we stay in our own tribes, we will be safer. We are being told that sameness is going to bring us safety, and I think that is an illusion. I think after so many decades of globalization, but not only it is about globalization, I think we were always interconnected, but today we are far more interconnected than ever before. So that means that the story of someone living in Pakistan will affect the life of someone living in Canada. Yeah? The happiness of someone living in Lebanon will affect the life or happiness of someone living in Norway, and so on. So we are, all of us, in this together. That's how I like to think, connections. And I think writing stories is mostly about paying attention to connections. I think there are lots of similarities between the art of storytelling and perhaps more spiritual journeys, because in both there's a desire to go beyond the boundaries of the self. In both there's a desire to maybe just move beyond the categories that we have been put into by birth, yeah, and to connect with the other, to the point that we see maybe there is no other, and the person that I have seen as the other is in fact so similar to myself. So I'm always interested in those connections, but perhaps I should mention that part of this comes from my upbringing, from my childhood. I was born in Strasbourg in France. Shortly afterwards, my parents separated, and I came to Turkey with my mother. And I was raised by a single mother, a working mother. And in late 1970s, early 1980s, in Turkey, in Ankara, this was a little bit unusual. We came with my mother to a very middle class, very conservative, very patriarchal neighborhood. And I remember very vividly at the time, women like my mother, because she was so young and she was a divorcee and she had no diploma, no job, no career. So immediately women in such positions are married off, and usually to someone older than themselves. And it was my grandmother who intervened, and she said, no, my daughter should go back to university, because my mom had dropped out of university, and she should get a diploma, she should have a career, she should have opportunities, she should have choices, and I'm going to take care of my granddaughter. So in my early years, I grew up next to my grandmother, who was very irrational, and her world was full of superstitions. But what struck me most, and I think what left a big impact on my writing and my life, was to see how these two women, my mom and my grandmother, supported each other. And I think what happened there and then left a big impact not only on my mother's life, but also my life and probably my children's lives as well. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is there are so many women, particularly in the Middle East, like my grandmother, who themselves are not very well educated, but who support wholeheartedly the education of their daughters, the independence of their daughters, the freedom of their daughters. And these women make such a huge difference in the lives of not only their daughters, but also of the next generations. And I think that was my first taste of two things. First, sisterhood. Sisterhood is a very important concept for me. I'm a big believer in that. And it's one of the concepts that I wanted to tackle in my latest novel. Some of you might have read The Three Daughters of Eve. In that book, there are three women, all of them young women. They're students at Oxford University, and they come from different backgrounds. There's Shirin, who's British-Iranian. She's the child of exiled parents, and she's very critical of all religions, but in particular, she's very critical of Islam because of the mistreatment of women and the lack of equality across the Muslim world, lack of gender equality. So she questions a lot. Then there's Mona, who is Egyptian-American in the novel, and she wears a headscarf. She's a practicing Muslim, and she complains, she criticizes Islamophobia, which is something she experiences almost on a daily basis. And the third girl is Peri, the Turkish one, and she has lots of questions. And I think we Turks are a little bit confused about so many things, so I wanted her to have lots of confusions. And together, they call themselves, jokingly, the sinner, the believer, and the confused. And maybe the question that I wanted to deal with as a writer was, can these girls still be friends? Can they still be sisters? Can they understand each other? It's a question that saddens me because I see the lack of that kind of sisterhood, particularly in countries like Turkey, where the political polarization is very deep and women are also badly divided. I always think when we women are so badly divided, the only thing that benefits from this is patriarchy itself, and we come from very patriarchal lands. So the solidarity that I've seen between my very westernized, educated, independent, feminist, urban, modern, secularist mother, and my much more Eastern, traditional, spiritual, superstitious, irrational grandmother, very completely two different women. The solidarity that I've seen in my childhood between these two women, in my opinion, does not exist in the Muslim world or in the Middle East today. We are badly politically divided, and these are questions that trouble me, that I like to ask myself. But I think I should wrap up by saying the way I see myself is just as a curious soul who likes to tell stories, who likes to learn stories. And I think, of course, as writers, we are interested in stories, but we're equally interested in silences. So the things that we can't talk about in any given society at a particular time. And I think it's the writer's job to ask, why is it that we can't talk about that question? This could be a taboo. It could be a political taboo. It could be a cultural taboo, social taboo, or a sexual taboo. But I think it's a storyteller's job to ask questions and hopefully to open up spaces. We need spaces, spaces in which a diversity of opinions can be heard, spaces where there is freedom of speech, and then take a step back. Because I don't like it when writers try to preach or when writers try to teach, but our job is to ask the questions and leave the answers to the readers. And it always amazes me to see, again, in countries like Turkey, where freedom of speech has been very badly bruised and broken. Unfortunately, our democracy has been declining, going backwards. Maybe we will talk about these things. But paradoxically, perhaps in such lands, stories maybe matter even more, or books matter even more, or stories do not evaporate as fast as maybe in some other parts of the world. And this is something that also intrigues me. In countries like Turkey, a book, a novel, is not a personal item. It's not something you read and then put on the shelf. You pass it on. Well, if you like it, if you like a book, you give it to your aunt. The aunt sends it to maybe her son who is doing his military service. And during that military service, soldiers share the same book. I have seen so many books in Turkey during book signing days that were brought to me and signed by different colored pens, because different people have read and they underline different sentences. So these are very, very precious experiences. And therefore, I've always thought that being a writer in a country like Turkey is a very fragmented experience, because on the one hand, you feel how suffocating it can be, how much freedom art needs, literature needs, to be able to ask questions. But on the other hand, the feedback that comes, the connection that comes from the readers is so precious. So I've seen both the dark side and the bright side of that experience. But overall, I would say both in my talks, in my interviews, but especially in my novels, I think one of the main concepts that I try to highlight is diversity, is cosmopolitanism. I know to some people maybe these sound like cliches, but I come from a country that has lost its diversity to a big extent, and I think by losing that, our loss in Turkey has been enormous. And I do sincerely believe that in this life, if we're going to learn anything at all, we learn it from people who are different from us, not exactly like us. Because someone who is exactly like me is only the echo of my voice. And that's a very narcissistic experience. A life based on sameness is a very narcissistic life. It means we only want to befriend people who dress up like us, who vote like us, who think like us, and who carry similar surnames. So in my books, in my talks, I like to think about what diversity means. And I'm aware that it is not an easy journey. I'm aware that it has lots of challenges for all of us, and nowadays more than ever before. But I do sincerely believe that it's a healthier and a much more peaceful way of looking at life than retreating into the so-called safety of same spaces. And maybe one last point that I would like to share with you is, as I keep commuting between East and West, the Middle East, Europe, America, I am also aware that all these boundaries that we take for granted are in fact much more fluid. Where do you draw the lines? Where do you draw the lines? Where do you draw the frontier of East? Where does West start? Where does East end? And I think a city like Istanbul teaches us that, because it's a city in which lots of things do come together. They do coexist, they do clash, but they are together historically and geographically. So it is these little questions that guide me, little curiosities. And what I like to do is just to think of the art of storytelling as an endless journey, as an ongoing journey that changes, hopefully, not only the person who reads the story, but also changes me as well. Because I think when I started writing each book, I was a different person. By the time I finish it, I'm a different person. Stories change us. Stories connect us. And I think we do learn through those connections. Otherwise, it's very difficult for us to empathize, to intellectually, spiritually connect. If there are no stories, the other is only a category. If there are no stories, the other is only statistics. It's only a number. So as human beings, our emotions, and I think we're all emotional creatures, everywhere, all of us. And we live at a time when emotions do guide politics. So we do have to talk about emotions. But most of our emotions are triggered by stories. And that's why I believe we need to hear multiple stories, not just a single story from this country or that country, but multiple stories that hopefully connect us better across boundaries. I'll stop here, but I'm really looking forward to continuing with your questions and Reverend's questions. Yeah.
A famous woman politician in this country once said, less than a year ago, a citizen of everywhere is a citizen of nowhere. What would you say, let's not imagine who that person was, but if she was sitting in the seat that I'm sitting in now, I'm sure you'd have a lot to say to her, but what would you say to encourage her to nuance that remark a little bit?
I think I briefly mentioned the role of emotions, but I didn't dwell upon it that much. I think we're living in an age in which there's lots of anger, lots of anxiety, apprehension, but also fear of the other, fear of future. And partly I think this is quite understandable, because we live in an age in which lots of things are happening very fast. It's a very liquid world we're living in. And we should allow people, we should understand those fears, those anxieties. If we do not let people voice their anxieties, my worry is we will be pushing them towards far-right or more populist movements where they think they're welcome with their anxieties. So to have spaces where we can have clash of opinions, diversity of opinions is incredibly important. That said, it makes me sad to observe that oftentimes politicians and mainstream politicians feel pushed almost to a corner by populist movements and demagogues. This is a quite interesting pattern, and of course coming from Turkey, I think I can tell you a lot about how dangerous it is when populist movements come to power by using the means of democracy, and then once they consolidate their power, use that power to silence other voices. We've seen that pattern in Turkey, but not only in Turkey, in many other parts of the world, there are interesting echoes, similarities, like in Hungary, like in Poland. So it's quite dangerous when populist movements come to power. But there's something else, even when they don't come to power, even when we're living in a relatively more mature democracy, for instance, the example of the Netherlands, this happened, even when populist movements are on the fringes, somehow they push mainstream politicians to speak in a much more nationalistic, sometimes almost jingoistic tone. And that is very worrying, because that means populist parties, even small parties, have a power beyond their size, have an impact beyond their size, because they speak directly to people's emotions. And so my worry is many mainstream politicians are affected by these tides that are affecting all of us across the world, East and West, and we need to pay more attention to nationalism, tribalism, isolationism. I would say, I think people who see themselves as citizens of the world are in fact people who care about bridges, are in fact people who care about connections. And we do need those bridges, and we will be needing them, I think, even more in the next decade.
Thank you. You spoke about Turkey very directly. I wonder if I could ask you, when cultures change, when political climates and societies change, they can change by importing a template, maybe from another context or an ideology, but they can also change by rediscovering something from their own tradition. Now, Turkey or Asia Minor, or that part of the world has got as rich a cultural heritage as anywhere in the world. Where in Turkey's history would you look for the most fertile or a highly fertile place of renewal and practices or traditions that might restore a Turkey that you could be more proud of today?
This is such an interesting question. I do care enormously about memory, and I think we in Turkey, we're a society of collective amnesia. Our relationship with the past is full of ruptures. It has been broken in so many ways. And as a result, we have two completely opposite attitudes to history in Turkey. I'm generalizing, but these are more or less the existing attitudes. On the one hand, you have the modernists who are future-oriented, less interested in history, and the rupture there is quite visible between the past and the present. And on the other hand, you have the conservatives and the nationalists who like to talk about the past, but in a very filtered way. And their attitude is usually whatever our ancestors did was great, and the moment you criticize it, immediately you can be labeled as a betrayer, as a traitor. And I find both attitudes very, very problematic. The first attitude is problematic because history is important. Memory is a responsibility. We need to talk about the past, understand the past, not in order to be stuck in the past, but first and foremost to see the continuities, hopefully never to make the same mistakes again, and to learn both from the beauties and the atrocities of the past. The other approach is very problematic because there's no freedom of speech there, and it just over-romanticizes a past that never, in my opinion, that never was. So we see similar attitudes in Turkey, in Russia, in countries that come from strong state tradition, that countries that come from imperial backgrounds. It's very interesting. We don't have this cognitive flexibility in Turkey because of the way we learn things at school. What we learn is when we go, and I went through the Turkish national curriculum education. What we learn is we were a great empire, we brought justice wherever we went, you know, we brought, not equality, but justice is mentioned a lot. So this is how we talk about the Ottoman Empire. But the story of the Ottoman Empire would be different if the story is told through the eyes of a Serbian peasant, or a Jewish miller, or an Armenian silversmith, or a concubine in the harem, or a prostitute who was accompanying the army. When you ask small questions about the lives of micro-individuals, how did they live? How did they experience the Ottoman Empire? Then we have multiple stories. So what we do not learn at school is that the angle, the interpretation of history might change all the time depending on who is telling the story. And in fact, there's no such thing as history with a big capital H. There are micro-histories. And we need to be able to hear history from the angle of the other. We don't do that. We get very easily offended in Turkey. So personally, I wouldn't depict any age as the golden age. I love thinking about history, reading about history, but we should be able to talk about both the beauties and the atrocities calmly.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you a bit about fiction now. Your work reminded me of a scene in an Ernest Hemingway novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. There's a scene during the Spanish Civil War where the main character who joins the Republican resistance kills a nationalist on horseback. Nationalist falls from the horse. The Republican goes and sifts through all his things. He finds his wallet, he finds a picture of his sweetheart, he finds some symbols of his Catholic faith, and then suddenly the whole sense of the righteousness of his cause just unravels as he's exposed as having killed a human being who loved somebody, who was a sincere believer. And it seems to me your work does exactly that kind of work in broadening our sympathies and enlarging our souls and helping us see the world, as you've just done, through the eyes of the other. Is that the heart of what fiction's about, and how it can be? I'm thinking now of the exhibition downstairs and how art can work too, and what that's celebrating. Is that close to what's really going on in your work?
I do understand and respect when people say all fiction is autobiographical. Of course, in every book there are echoes of the writer. But frankly, from the very beginning, that wasn't the magnet, the thing that pulled me towards literature. In other words, the way I started writing, and I started writing at an early age, not because I was planning to become a writer. I didn't even know such a thing was possible at the time. But I was a very lonely child, and I thought my life was terribly boring. And the world that I found in Storyland was much more colorful and much more real to me than the so-called real life. And that's how everything started. So rather than telling my story to other people, what I was interested in was not becoming myself, becoming someone else, and then someone else, and then someone else. And those journeys are really, really endless. That part of fiction is very close to my heart. And I think, particularly in the world of literature, it's interesting to try to give more voice to the silenced, to the people who have been more marginalized, pushed to the periphery, and ask, what if he tells the story? What if she tells the story? What if I can look at the so-called truth from their eyes? Just to ask those little questions. That kind of cognitive flexibility is something that I appreciate a lot. So rather than seeing my work as autobiographical, for me it's all about connecting with the other.
Now, I'd like to take a bit of a risk as a Western white male and ask you about gender, because it came through in what you said so movingly about your family and of the causes that you've taken up as a campaigner. So I'm going to suggest something, but please tell me if I'm completely wrong. What I heard from your story, particularly about your mother, with her mother, and then of course with you and your story, is a certain way of understanding feminism. And for many people, feminism carries the risk of replicating some of the dogmatism of what it's opposed in some formulations. But what you were describing with your mother was a woman who had, whether by choice or by necessity, I'm not party to that, found herself in a place in life where she wasn't defining her life by what a man was doing in that life. She was defining her life by other criteria. Is that something of what perhaps a woman in Turkey today, with plenty of social constraints, might aspire to do? Is that something of what, I'm not obviously just in Turkey, perhaps in any culture. I'm trying to sort of get at a notion of feminism that isn't inevitably antagonistic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think both because of my upbringing and my worldview, to me, gender equality is an incredibly important subject. And when I like to think about feminism, I like to think about feminisms. I think there have been various feminist theories, movements throughout the decades. I am a feminist, and I have lots of respect for particularly women, but women and men who struggled so that we could enjoy the rights that we're enjoying today. And it's very easy to forget that what we have today is the outcome of a long, long history, of a long, long struggle. So to have that kind of not only gender awareness, but historical awareness is very important to me. That said, I also worry about the gaps between cultures, as I mentioned, particularly between, among women who come from different worldviews, who come from different backgrounds, and the lack of a sisterhood and the lack of a dialogue among them is something that troubles me. I'm a feminist, but I'm also aware that the word feminism, unfortunately, does not travel far and wide, especially as you go towards East or the Middle East or towards other parts of the world. I have met people when I was in Istanbul, very well educated. I never forget this scholar who came from America to Istanbul for a research. And she, for instance, told me that it was very understandable that I was a feminist since I was a Turkish woman. Of course, I had to be a feminist because Turkey was so patriarchal. But I always thought, but you also
don't you think, patriarchy is universal? We're all in this together. So that attitude is very problematic, as if feminism is needed only in some parts of the world, but not in other parts of the world. I like to question these things. In addition to the word feminism, I think we need the word sisterhood, and I'm aware that the word sisterhood can travel wider than the word feminism. But I also believe that women's movement and awareness, which is very much needed today than even before, because countries do slide backwards, societies do go backwards, we can't take it for granted. So I think this is an interesting time for global women's movement, but I do believe that needs to go hand in hand with LGBT movement, with support for minority rights, sexual minority rights, because they're all connected and we're all in this together. To me, it's amazing to see how in countries like Turkey, there are very strong women. Patriarchal countries doesn't mean women are victims or passive or silent. Just the opposite in Turkey. We have lots of Turkish, Kurdish, Alevi, Jewish, Armenian, Greek, women of all backgrounds in all fields of life who are very powerful, strong, and particularly in certain fields such as medicine, academia. In academia, the percentage has been quite high. Arts, obviously, but there's one field in which women almost are non-existent, and that's politics. So at the local, regional, and national level of politics, when it comes to decision making, it's a very male-dominated world, and the very few women who can exist there usually try to defeminize, desexualize themselves. They feel obliged to do that. So those are the areas that need to change. I'm also aware that even though we have strong matriarchs, because patriarchal societies can have strong matriarchs in the private space, in the home, those matriarchs do not necessarily use their power in order to support other women, younger women, joining the family, like the daughters-in-law. And sometimes their attitude can be, I suffered, now it's her turn. So we can never break that chain of patriarchy. And I am also aware that one of my books is about honor killings, is about the concept of honor, which I think has nothing honorable in it. And it particularly focuses on mother-son relationship, how we raise our sons as the sultans, as the mini sultans in the family. And we teach them that they have a right to keep an eye on the chastity of their sisters, of their nieces, and how that affects and how that makes everyone unhappy. So in a nutshell, of course, patriarchal societies are lands in which women are unhappy, but I think men also are unhappy. And it's not easy to be a young man in such cultures, particularly for young males who have different visions, different imaginations, or who do not conform to the given description of masculinity. Life can be very hard for them as well. And sometimes, unfortunately, people who mock them, ridicule them, scorn them can be women too. So this is very complicated. Patriarchy is very complicated. It's not black and white. And we have to see how we also take part in it. So rather than questioning men versus women, I like to question what masculinity is, what femininity is. And for me, gender is fluid. I don't believe in these binary oppositions of gender patterns.
One last question from me, and then I'm going to take a question from every single person in the audience, all channeled through just 3 or 4, who miraculously will sum up the thoughts of everybody. But one last one from me. This is obviously a community of faith at St. Martin's, and a building built for faith. And you've described yourself as not a person of faith, but a bit as somebody who is fascinated by faith, so long as it includes a place for doubt. But you've also talked very warmly about Sufism. And I wondered if you could say a bit about that, particularly because you're so well known as an activist, and Sufism, perhaps a stereotype, might be seen as a very different kind of spirituality or temperament to activism. Could you talk a little bit about what makes your soul sing?
Thank you so much. I think what I do not, maybe I can start with the things I don't like much. Maybe that's easier. What I don't like is certainty. When there's too much certainty, absolute certainty, I find that very, very dangerous.
And sometimes I observe, many times I observe that kind of certainty in religious people. They can be very confident of the ground beneath their feet, of their own truths. But we can also observe that kind of certainty among atheists as well, who can also be very confident of their own truths, about their own truths. And so that kind of certainty is, to me, it's troubling. I like confusion. I'm okay with confusion, asking questions and not knowing, but learning. So for me, agnosticism is much closer, and also the kind of mysticism that doesn't try to preach, the kind of mysticism that is very much heterodox, on the fringes. And there were mystics like that all throughout centuries. I find it very interesting, and I do like to imagine that scene. I think if we could bring together maybe Teresa de Avila or Meister Eckhart with Isaac Luria or Abu Lafia or Ibn Arabi or Rumi or Shams or Rabia, if they could sit around a table, dinner table, I honestly think they would break bread together. They would share water together, and they would understand each other, because they said incredibly similar things. These people who have never seen each other, but they were mystics, and some of them were misfits. So I like those misfits and mystics. I personally am not a religious person. I'm not even a believer, but I'm someone who's interested in faith. And I think faith without doubt is a dogma, and dogmas are dangerous. On the other hand, doubt on its own without faith is also just trying to fly with one wing. You need a little bit of faith in life, a little bit of room for things that is beyond, our maybe concrete perceptions. I think there are secular acts of faith as well in life. So for instance, when you start writing a novel, you don't know whether you're going to succeed, you don't know where the story is going to take you, but you do it anyhow. That's a secular act of faith. You move to a different country, you move to a different city, you have no clue why you're doing this, but you do it anyhow. You follow this weird urge or call. You can't explain it. That's a secular act of faith. You fall in love with someone, you don't know that person that well, you go on a journey, a lifelong journey together. Love is a secular act of faith. So I think there are all these islands of secular acts of faith in our lives, and we need the dance of faith and doubt together. So my problem with very religious people is that they want to get rid of doubt, and my problem with very atheist or absolutely atheist people is that they want to get rid of faith, and I want them to dance together. And there were people who talked about this. There's a poem by Ibn Arabi, for instance, when they ask him how he describes himself, are you a Muslim, are you this, are you that? He talks about the caravan of love, and he says, I follow the caravan of love. If that caravan goes to a mosque, I will go to a mosque, I will pray in a mosque, but afterwards the caravan will continue. If it goes to a synagogue next, the synagogue will be my abode of prayer, and then the caravan will continue and we will go to a church. I will pray in a church, but the journey is endless. Next we will go to a desert. We will pass through a desert, I will pray in the desert, then through a forest. What matters is the journey, not the stops on the way. So this kind of talk is very radical, we forgot that. There were such people, there were such scholars, philosophers, who were much more interested in the possibility of faith. Whereas today I think we became so obsessed with political differences, religious differences, proving that that we are closer to the truth. So that kind of exclusivist attitude of collectivistic religion is something that is not close to my heart. I think collectivistic religions assume that there's an us and there's a them, and somehow us is closer to truth than them. So that duality doesn't work for me, but more individualistic journeys, spiritual journeys, and those journeys are unique like our fingerprints. Nobody can dictate those journeys, and everybody's journey might take them to a completely different destination. You might start as a Sufi, you might end up as an agnostic, or vice versa, but I respect those individual spiritual journeys.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to take some questions. There's probably only time for 3, 4, possibly 5. There's only one rule. Everybody here needs to remember that anything that Elif has to say is much more interesting than any of the rest of us has to say. So the less we say, the more she gets to say, and that's what we're all here for. So can I take the person standing just at the corner there?
Because you situate yourself in the Balkans, which to me denotes the notion of new spaces, unlike the Occidental and Oriental, which is in opposition. I just wanted to ask you, could you elaborate on the Balkan for you? Is it an in-between space? Is it a liminal space, bridging different races and religions? I'm just interested in that.
Thank you. So the question is to ask Elif to elaborate on the metaphor or the insight into the experience of the Balkans. Is that a liminal space? How would you describe it? Is there such a thing as the Balkans as a whole?
I think I mentioned it when I was talking about multiple belongings. But I guess I do observe I like to observe cultural differences, but without forgetting the nuances, without forgetting the layers, the fragments. Maybe I'm going to give an indirect answer, but in my previous novel, The Architect's Apprentice, I also wanted to dwell upon this continuity and lack of continuity, you know, how history is broken with ruptures, how in many parts of the Western world, knowledge could accumulate, and how we weren't able to do that, and why is that? So, for instance, also in this novel, comparing Oxford University with Istanbul, when you go to Oxford, to Bodleian Library, to me it's fascinating to see those big signs on the walls that say, give the names of the patrons who supported the library throughout the centuries. And those were turbulent centuries in British history. They were not easy centuries. But the support for culture or the accumulation of knowledge was continuous. In the East, in the Middle East, in the Balkans, there are more ruptures when I look at the accumulation of culture. Another example that I try to explore in my previous novel is I wrote about the time of Sinan, the architect Sinan, which, as you know, left so much amazing, you know, architectural heritage, both in Istanbul and all across, beyond Istanbul. But when you look at his life, it's sad to see the lack of continuity. At the time of Sinan, there was this very important, they used to call them stargazers, scientists, who came from Syria, actually. His name was Taqiyuddin. And he was an amazing, a genius at the time. And an observatory was built for him and for his team so that they could work. And interestingly, at the time in Europe, there was another observatory built for Tycho Brahe, who was another genius, so that they could work. Now, when you look at their lives, what happened to the scientists in the East and what happened to the scientists in the West, the stories are completely different. Because the one in the East, the one in Istanbul, after a year and a half, it was razed down. Mostly because of the words of the ulema who said, you know, we shouldn't be watching the skies, it's sin, it's a günah. God should be watching us. And the library inside, all those scientific instruments, cutting edge instruments, everything razed down, destroyed. Whereas the one in Europe lived, survived, and it paved the way for new achievements. So these are the things that I worry about, you know, those fragments, not only geographically, culturally, how they keep us apart from each other because of nationalism, tribalism, but also how our connection with the past is full of ruptures. And as a result of that, culture cannot accumulate, knowledge cannot accumulate.
Thank you. Just halfway back on this side.
Good evening, Elif. It's such a joy to be here and hear you. Thank you for this. I wanted to ask you, I come from Moldova and I've been many times to Istanbul, and you described Istanbul, if it would be a person, it would be a she, a female. And given that you've lived almost 80 years in London, I'm wondering, what if London would be a person, how would you describe that person? Thank you.
So this is a question about, given your diverse background, what London particularly means to you.
I came to London for several reasons. About 8 years ago, I cherished the fact that it was so diverse. I cherished the fact that as a writer, I could have freedom of speech. I cherished the fact that as a woman, I could walk on the streets without being sexually harassed. You know, I'm giving you all these examples that perhaps we take for granted and we don't think about much. But when you come from other cultures where you have also experienced the lack of these rights that we enjoy, maybe you appreciate those rights more. And I know to people, many people, especially politicians, the word multiculturalism, the word diversity doesn't mean anything, and they have just tossed it aside, thrust it aside. But what did we replace it with? What is the alternative? To me, it's incredibly important that on the streets of London, so many different languages are being spoken, and there is coexistence. I'm not romanticizing it, I'm aware that there are problems as well, but the basis of that diversity is very important. To me, it's important that when children go to school in this country, they learn about different religions. It's important that when they have friends from all kinds of backgrounds. It's important that when you go to a school in London, you know, when you look at the dining rooms, the charts that they have on the walls, children who don't eat meat, children who don't eat pork, children who don't eat, you know, this and that, because they come from different faiths and they're all friends. These are incredibly important experiences that unfortunately we deny our children in many other parts of the world. I find it sad that many children in Turkey only learn about one religion and one interpretation of religion or one nationalistic interpretation of history. So this kind of diversity, both on our streets, also in our education system, but particularly in this city, to me it's a treasure. And I find it sad that people not only take it for granted, but sometimes see it as a burden. There was a very striking, actually, Pew Research Center survey conducted a year ago across Europe, and it's very sad to see so many Europeans, particularly in 8 countries, saying, because of diversity, my country became a worse place to live. This is the perception in 1/3 of Europeans across the European continent. And it's sad because how fast we forget history. It is as if we have learned nothing from history, and we're not talking about history, you know, centuries ago, but history in living memory. How sad to see that we have not learned where nationalism, extreme tribalism might take us again. So to me, London is very special, and I do believe that there aren't many cities like London around the world.
Thank you. I'm going to ask for a very, very brief last question and a very brief last answer.
When and how did you start listening to your soul?
That's a very brief question, and I'm looking forward, commendably brief answer, to a commendably brief answer.
What an amazing question. Thank you so much.
When and how do you start listening to your soul?
I think when I'm writing fiction. And it's amazing. It is as if we use a different part of our brain. You know, in daily life, we're very different people as writers. We're introverts, and our task thrives upon solitude. And sometimes the danger is we have high inflated egos, because all other artists know how to collaborate. They know the importance of teamwork, except novelists. Because we work alone, we create worlds in our mind, we kill characters, create characters, so we can end up with very high inflated egos. That's the downside. But the beauty of being alone in that solitude is you can meet the diversity inside. And then I feel very free. I wish I could feel as free in my daily life, but I feel that kind of freedom when I'm writing stories.
Wow. Now, Paul Gordon has got something that he's going to say to us.
This evening, before we end the program, we would like to make a special presentation of the first Caravan Award. The Caravan Award goes to an individual of artistic, literary, academic, or religious distinction that has used the arts in exceptional ways for peace-building or bridge-building purposes. And we'd like to present this award this evening to none other than Elif Shafak, whose story, and she, by the way, she doesn't know about this. And as we've seen this evening, her storytelling has profoundly transcended Eastern and Western boundaries of faith and culture. And as you see over here, we have a donkey. Now, this is a work of original art, both the sculpture and the painting of a well-known Egyptian artist, Dr. Reda Abdurrahman. And we selected the donkey because the donkey, as you know, in the Christian and Islamic tradition, represents peace. Jesus coming into Jerusalem on a donkey. The second caliph, Omar ibn al-Khattab, comes into Jerusalem on a donkey, meaning I'm coming in peace. And of course, throughout the Middle East, even in parts of Turkey, the donkey is also a beast of burden, and the poorest of the poor use the donkey, and it also symbolizes compassion. And Elif has very, very successfully shown us through her work, artistic work, that the only way forward is one of in peace and with compassion. And it's a real privilege, Elif, to award you the Caravan Award.
Thank you so much.